Brown Bag seminar on how to webify your desktop applications. I'm John Brown. I'm the Technical Product Manager here at Mobilize.net. And I hope that you are going to learn something today and have some good questions for us when we walk through this. Let me just show you very quickly the agenda for our session. I'd like to talk about initially some of the problems of moving from Windows client server two-tier architecture to a fully formed modern web application. Talk about what to do in general with some legacy issues that you have with old applications and how to think about an outcome for them. Demo some new technology that we've been developing here at Mobilize.net that can cut the time and effort and pain of moving some of those desktop apps over to the web application architecture, and then open it up for Q&A. So let's get started, shall we? We are about a 20-plus-year-old company that has offices around the world. We have been working in strictly the legacy modernization space, primarily focused on the Windows stack, the Microsoft stack, for a number of years now, and we have global 1,000 customers all over the world. We have partnerships with a number of major vendors such as Microsoft, global systems integrators such as Avanade and Accenture and Infosys. So we have done a lot of projects, and we have built a lot of tools that are used really by thousands and thousands of developers every year. So before we jump into demo, let's talk about the issues of client server versus the web. Your Windows application that you've written from Win32 or VB6 or Silverlight or whatever it is has a lot of things in common. And one of them is that Windows gives us a very clean authentication mechanism, whether it's the Windows login and user management itself or its Active Directory for the enterprise. Your PC knows who you are when you're using it. You have a local file system on your hard drive or multiple hard drives that's always accessible through your Win API or your .NET API. Your application is running in a private process that is exclusive and it's well managed, and you don't have to worry about that memory being destroyed before you're ready to terminate a process. So you have persistence of objects that are created in memory, and you know that you can access them anytime you want. You have this slick Windows registry that you can store information in, and you can actually inquire about the state of other Windows. Anything you want to know about Windows will be in the registry. You have a rich set of user interface controls and objects that you can draw on to create interesting and compelling screens for data entry or data presentation via the .NET libraries. And of course, you always have access directly through the hardware abstraction layer to look at the physical hardware that's attached to the device through things like USB ports or SCSI devices or even over network interfaces. So you can access the hardware via calls to the operating system. When you have an application, however, that's running in a browser and is served as a web application, you really don't have access to any of those things. You don't have any authentication mechanism by default. You know, if somebody just opens up a web browser and types in a URL, and it's going to create a request to the server. So the server has to sort out, do I want to actually let you have access to the page you've asked for? You don't really have access to our local file system that you can browse and open files and save files to. The process space that we're really interested in is on the server, and it's not private to your execution thread. It's shared by as many sessions as are going on simultaneously, and you don't really have any control on when that process or the state that you're holding in your process will be destroyed or cached or moved around. You don't know where it's going to physically reside. You know, if you're in a server farm It could be spread all over multiple servers. So you don't really have any control over that. You don't have a registry that you can access. You have a very limited, by default, you have very limited user experience objects because HTML, which is the default markup language for the web, was not designed to be a graphical markup language. It was designed to describe the structure of documents. And of course, you have extremely limited access to the hardware. Further, realistically, you don't know much about the device that the browser is running on. You may not know or be able to guarantee what browser or what browser version is running, what operating system the browser is on, what the screen real estate dimensions are. So it's not nearly as defined as it is in the Windows world. Okay, so let's take a little side road now and think about the problem of dealing with all of the applications that you have that are legacy. So if every company that's been around for a while, especially organizations of any size and impact, have written a lot of code. And the code tends to last a long time, and then at some point it becomes legacy code. It was written by somebody else, it was updated and updated and updated, it's maybe developed a lot of problems. So if we were to take all the applications that we have in an application portfolio inside the organization and bucket them according to a couple of different variables. All right, so one variable we want to measure, which I've indicated here on the vertical axis, is how important, how critical, how unique is the application to the functioning of the business. Okay, so does it provide competitive advantage from the concept of it's not unique, it's not particularly critical, to it provides tremendous competitive advantage, it's completely unique. The other axis is what's the technical quality of the application in terms of is it correct, is it free of defects, does it meet the business requirements, does it represent, is it coded in a language that's currently in support, is it running on a platform that's currently in support. So from low, meaning a lot of technical debt maybe and a lot of obsolescence, to high, the code is clean, it's well structured, it's loosely coupled, it's written in a modern language like Java or C# or JavaScript or Python or something like that. So looking at this and breaking it into 4 buckets, let's start at the bottom right corner, the applications that are well structured but are not very valuable, probably aren't worth investing in, so that's our do nothing quadrant. Going clockwise from there, the applications that are of low quality and low value possibly can be replaced with commercial off-the-shelf software, maybe an implementation of Salesforce or Microsoft Dynamics or SAP or Oracle or something could be configured to replace the functionality in those apps. Jumping to the top right quadrant, applications that are super important and are in great shape, those are the applications you want to put your best developers on. You want to keep them up to date. You want to maintain them and make sure they don't accumulate technical debt going forward. And then finally, the big 3-colored quadrant in the top left, these are applications that are important, but they've got problems. So they need to either be rewritten, repaired, or modernized. If they don't meet the functional requirements and the business logic is broken, then possibly you just have to start from scratch and write them over again. If they are functionally correct but they are full of defects, perhaps you need to review your engineering process and think about the way that you're doing quality assurance before you release code, or the way that you do code reviews or something like that. And then finally, the applications that have good business logic, it's complex business logic, they need to be revised frequently. The source code is important, but it's out of date. It may not be as architected as well as you'd like, but again, there's valuable business process codified there, there's valuable algorithms and trade secrets. Those are a good thing to think about modernizing through tools. Because you can cover a lot more ground quickly when you use some sort of automation, some sort of tool set to bring those forward. And that's one of the things we're going to show you today. So the technology that's the most radical here at Mobilize.net is a product called WebMap. And WebMap basically allows you to go from the desktop directly to a well-formed modern web application. And by that, I'm not talking about some way to virtualize the application, just put it, on a server so that people can remote desktop into it. I'm talking about transforming the source code from, classic WinForms, event handlers written right into the code behind the actual objects on the form, to a 3-tier model view controller, well-formed modern web application. So very, very state-of-the-art architecture. So how does it work? Again, from C# and WinForms, which is a very common way for people to build Windows applications, over to ASP.NET MVC4. We create a single-page application pattern on the client. We use a lot of tools like JavaScript and AJAX and JSON and JavaScript frameworks to build this, and I'll show you all of that shortly. We keep all of your, here's the critical point, we keep all of your business logic intact. So we don't introduce any new defects to the migration tool set. And that means that you can rapidly bring this application online without having to worry about completely revalidating and hunting down defects in the core logic and algorithms of the code. Basically, all you're going to really do here is transform the user interface and build a new architecture around it. On the client side, what you're going to see is a combination of HTML5 with CSS for styling. We're going to use, at your choice, one of 2 different JavaScript frameworks in order to create a model view, view model architecture, and also to build all of the user experience, all the user interface elements. So we have 2 right now that we've implemented. One is Telerik's Kendo UI, which gives you a very Windows sort of look and feel. It's not a responsive design, so it's great for control-rich forms that need to have placement where you've got maybe a tab order that you're used to. Your users are used to the way these forms look, and you know it's going to be running on a fairly large desktop. The other alternative is for a more modern look and feel. We have support for Angular with Bootstrap, so you get a completely responsive application, and it looks much more web-like than the Kendo look and feel, but it will be a very different look than the original Windows app was. On the server side, as I said before, we're converting the C#.NET WinForms architecture over to a model view controller pattern using ASP.NET. And we're using a lot of technologies like inversion of control to manage the individual sessions and state, things like that. Straight ahead session management from ASP.NET, so if you're familiar with that pattern, it's very easy to maintain it. We're using the ASP.NET security model as well. This will become a cloud-enabled, a cloud-ready application that you can actually publish and run directly from the cloud right away. Of course, if you want to scale it, you need to think about the fact that you'll probably want to look at how to make it more efficient, maybe with using something like Redis for scalable state management, things like that. So let's look at a demo real quick. I'm going to switch away to a different screen. So here I'm going to show you a classic VB6 application here. My virtual machine will wake up. Wake up, virtual machine. So this is VB6. You know, it goes back to the Windows XP days. I know we've all seen code like this. Now, a few moments ago, I was talking about C# and .NET. Why am I showing VB6? because there's a lot of code out there, a lot of applications that have value that are written in VB6 and they're still running and people would like to move them forward. So we have a two-step or what we call a double jump process to deal with that. The first step is we use a tool that we developed a number of years ago called the Visual Basic Upgrade Companion. And I'm going to show you moving this VB6 application over to C# running on .NET and converting all of the VB Forms package to WinForms. So let's look at what this VB6 application does. Like a lot of VB6 line of business applications or even commercial applications, it's forms on top of data. So this is an application that we developed internally that is representative of a lot of those sorts of things. It's for a pretend seafood company. It's sort of our version of Northwind Traders, and it allows you to order seafood products, to create invoices, to update inventory. It understands customers and products and prices. It has an access database, an MDB file behind it. So this is exactly like a lot of code that a lot of people have, and then maybe they'd use Crystal reports to generate output that was formatted and it could be printed. So VB6. So now how do we get that off of the web? So right here in this view is our tool, the Visual Basic Upgrade Companion. And what I've done is I've actually loaded that VB6 application source code into the VBUC. And the first thing that's going to happen here is it will find all of the external references, in this case a lot of OCXs and some DLLs. This is objects from the standard Microsoft library, including things like ADO.db and so forth for database access. So it has to find all the objects, and it has found them. We get to pick from some options when we do our upgrade, like for example, how do we want to migrate controls, like if we had 4-point spread, or in this case we have the Microsoft Data Grid control, we're going to move it to a .NET native control. We're going to take our ADO.db code and we're going to move it to ADO.NET. So we're going to change all that record set stuff into something that works actually modern in .NET and not old-fashioned stuff. So we get to make a lot of these choices, and if we want to, we can actually go in here and we can look at what that code would look like so we have some ideas about sampling. When we're finished, we just click on Confirm Options and we start our upgrade. Notice that we can choose between C# and Visual Basic. We can pick the version of Visual Studio that we want to create an emitted project structure for, and some other things. So we would start that up and let it run, and it's just going to run a preprocessor to parse everything and start generating code. In the interest of saving time, I've actually already done that, and I can bring that up very quickly right here. So what we're going to do is create an upgraded directory wherever we point the tool. And in that upgraded directory, we're going to actually see that we have .cs files now instead of .bas, and we have a new solution file. So let's fire that up in Visual Studio 2015 and see what we get. The goal of the tool is twofold. The first goal is to create really good code that the developer will recognize from the original application. So we're going to preserve namespaces, we're going to preserve variable object names, we're going to preserve the code patterns and the structure of the code, and we're going to preserve all the comments. Okay, so if you were familiar with the original application, given that you understand some basics about .NET and you understand some basics about C#, you should be able to understand this application quite well. For example, looking at the code, if I put this up next to the VB code, it would look pretty familiar. Now, obviously, there's some differences because there's a lot of syntactic differences between VB and .NET. The second goal of the migration tool is to create a great deal of fidelity in the look and feel of the finished application to the original application. So you see our splash screen comes up when we run it. Here's our form. It looks very much like the original VB form. It works very much like the original VB form. I click here and I move the focus down to the line quantity, and I can change it does the database lookup for the price per item, does the multiplication, creates the table. But now, instead of running in VB and on VB forms, we are running on using the WinForms form designer. So I have all of these capabilities. I can use the toolbox to move these objects around in design mode. All the things I'm used to doing as a .NET developer. Super. One last point. There's no runtime here. This is there's some support files, but if you open them up, you'll see that they are all C# classes, C# code. So there's some runtime stuff here to make the mapping a little more straightforward in terms of the source code, but it's all source code. Now, this is great. You've got a Windows application. You've removed your dependency on finding people that are fluent in VB6, but it's not a web application. So what do we do about that? Well, let's look to a slightly newer version of this same product, which is called WebMap. So we talked about this before. And the way that we start a WebMap application is using a website called studio.mobilize.net. You can get a free account on here, and you can try your own migrations as well. So what we do is we simply say I want to mobilize my app. We're going to, my first step is log back in when we time out. And so the first step is going to be to download a little executable that you point to your C# WinForms file. So if you look at this timeline here, you download this assessment wizard, you run an assessment of the source code, which collects metadata such as how many objects are there, what kind of objects, what kind of dependencies, what's the project structure, how many lines of code are there, and so forth. It then will upload that metadata, not your source code, back up to this web portal and run an analysis, which will then be presented visually to you. Okay? So we run this, and it's hiding back there, right? So now we're going to choose, you can analyze VB code as well, VB6 code. We're going to choose WebMap. We're going to point to that solution that we were just looking at, which is, yep, right here. Okay. Accept the terms and run an assessment. Again, what we're doing is we're going to download this little tool. It's a Microsoft Click Once technology, which means that when it's finished running, it will it won't persist. It's running in a little sandbox. So it's going to basically collect a lot of XML data, and it's going to write the output of that data to a folder called assessment. So when it gets done, you'll find that there's actually some data in there that you can go and look at. It's the XML data and an HTML representation of it that we will actually upload. So when it's done, it uploads the data, and we process it and open up a browser window with the data there. In this assessment, you'll be able to see a sort of a color grade of red, yellow, and green, and it will tell you how much of your code can be easily migrated to the web, how much of it will be problematic, and how much of it might require some degree of customization. Okay, so here's some information, and we see, for example, a pie chart over here about how much design code and logic code we have. Over here we see our readiness to migrate, and notice that it's selected Kendo UI. We can also pick Angular and Bootstrap over here and compare that. There's a bunch of other information here. We talk about how many features and objects. There's a great deal of data about your application, such as we run a dependency analysis, and we give you a list of controls and so forth that you can look at once you run this analysis. But what we really want to do here is just migrate it. So because we see that 91% of the objects, the properties, the methods, the event handlers will work nicely under Kendo UI, 5% are not available. Those are classes and objects that have no corollary in the web. So they might be a direct reference to a path on a hard drive. They might be a pinvoke, lookup to the registry, something like that. And 4% are things that could be mapped to HTML but just aren't yet in the tool. So if you see yellow when you run an assessment, if you talk to us directly, we can give you a quick idea of whether that's already been done and the assessment tool hasn't simply been published yet, or whether we can customize it for you. So when we migrate it, the first step is we have some defaults here about how we handle font generation in our CSS files and JavaScript we create. So do we want to optimize the resulting application for size or speed? I'm going to leave the defaults here. And then the next step is that we have to drop our code on here. So I go to the, let's delete this old one here. And what I'm going to do is simply take all the code in my code tree here, including the code that was generated by the BBUC, and I'm going to create a and then I'm just going to drag that zip file onto here. And it will now upload all my source code, including the assessment data, up to the Azure web job that we're running here. So it says it's uploaded it. I can see the code here that's in the solution, and now I can say I want to migrate it. So what it's going to do is it's going to actually start that migration in a couple of minutes. We're spooling it up on Azure, depending on how many other people are running on Azure at the time. It will run it, it'll generate the code, and we'll be able to take a look at it. It may take a few minutes because we've had a lot of people lately using it. So let me pull one up that has already been migrated while we wait for this one. And don't worry, I don't have to keep looking for it. It'll send me an email when it's finished. So I'll know to go back here and click on the link. But here's one, looks good. So let's look at this one. And I believe this is the same application. Yeah, Salmon King Seafood. And we can see, right, it looks like it hasn't been migrated yet, so let me go back to my migrations. And look at this one. So here's one that we did migrate recently, and after the migration, we have a couple of new tabs here. So one of them is Compare. And this allows us to actually see the results of the migration at the source code level, both file structure and individual code level. So it takes a moment to retrieve this and rebuild the view. So here's on old files. This is our original code, and you see it says C#. We still have some C#, but now we have controllers, and we have models, and we have scripts, and we have resources, and we have some TypeScript. So remember that we moved this over from basically a flat 1 or 2 tier architecture to model view controller. Okay, and if we want, we can actually compare some of these files. Let's see, I think this one. Or this one. So some of these files you can actually compare how the code changed. So now you can see, for example, that a lot of this code got relocated. We're now referencing, if we look right here, instead of referencing a show message event, we're actually referencing a view manager of it. Okay. So we've created this model view abstraction of all of our user interface elements to not only make it easier to change what the user sees, but also to test and maintain this code. We can even see what some of the HTML screens are going to look like by, for example, selecting some of the new HTML screens, and we'll do a representation in the browser of what the screen looks like. It's not a very good styling because there's a lot of information we can't process at this point until it's been compiled, but you get an idea of all the objects that are there, and if there's a reference we can't resolve, we'll just leave a blank space and draw a red box around it. So once we're done, what we can do is download the application. Now, you can certainly look at our sample code. If you want to download your own application, you have to contact our sales department. We have to work out an arrangement for that. So what would that look like once it's downloaded? Well, here's one that is around the same migration. And so here's our new source code. So let's open it up in Visual Studio and take a look and see what we got. Okay, well, there's a lot more files. So if we collapse everything, we have some helper files here, which again are straight-ahead.NET C# stuff. Normally you won't have to do anything with those, but because they're in source code, you can read them, you can change them, you can do whatever you want with them. There's no restrictions on those. What you will notice is that now, in addition to all of these, the original source code here that had our C# code that has all our logic in it. Okay, and again, this logic is very much similar to what we had coming out of the VB6 transformation to .NET. The difference being that now we see things like for every physical object, we're going to be referencing a view model of those objects. We're not going to be referencing the object directly like we would in a classic sort of a code behind the UI model. So here's where our business logic stays. Okay. In addition, we now have controllers, and what follows that? That is format stock manual. So we go to that same form, and we look at the controller. It's basically going to handle the routing of events. Okay. So it's a pretty straightforward ASP.NET model. We also have models, and if we look at those, we're going to see that we are basically just structuring this encapsulation of the user interface to handle the pass-through of changes from the client back to the server and then from the server back to the client. We can look at all of our HTML we're going to generate. Okay. So every form, here's that same form. We generate HTML. So we're basically generating HTML elements for all of the physical ID, all the physical UI elements that are on the screen, and then those will get instantiated by the Kindle library or the Angular library as something that is representative. We also have CSS for each form where we style each of these objects. So we've taken the properties from the designer file C# and moved it over and recreated it as a CSS file. So what's it look like? Let's build it and run it. So here's our splash screen. Here's our menu structure that we've created. So it looks very much like the Windows version. We have a form that looks very much like the Windows version. And it works very much like the Windows version. So, you know, the tab order, the click handling, the event handling is basically the same. And we haven't, at this point, had to write any code. Now, set your expectations correctly. It doesn't mean that you can take an app that's 700,000 lines of Windows C# code or even VB code, run it through this process, and have a perfectly well-formed web application and you not have to do any changes to. However, this does prove that you can have a fairly rich, Visual Basic application that sits on top of a database. And if you stayed sort of along the standard lines of objects and controls and references and code structures, you can get pretty good code out of this that can compile and run right away, or with some modest cleanups. Things that you'll run into in any kind of transformation like this is if you've used weak typing in your VB code, it's not going to work very well when you get to .NET. You're going to want to have strong typing. So you're going to want to go through maybe and look at those things that you used a variant on and change them to what's explicit, so that you're not using the same object, and one moment it's a form, and the next moment it's a string, and the next moment it's a double. Those will cause you some runtime problems. We can handle some runtime events, for example, control arrays that are defined at runtime. We can map those sorts of things. Where you've got code that assumes, for example, that you're going to write a file to the hard drive for the user, or you're going to read an INI file, or you're going to format something for the printer and send it to the printer. That stuff doesn't work on the web, so you'll have to sit down and think about how you want to rewrite that particular block of code to make more sense on the web. For example, you've got a report that you generate. Well, instead of sending printer codes to the USB port, you can invoke a web service that generates a PDF and stores the PDF in on your server, or in Azure Blob, or AWS Blob storage, and then gives the user a URL to the PDF, so the user can either display it on a device, or could display it and then send it to a physical printer from the host device for the browser, whether it's Windows or Mac OS or iOS or Android or whatever. We can also, as I said earlier, we can build a Kendo version. So what would that look like? I think I've got one here. Let me just take a look real quick. Yeah, here's one. So if we run that same app through WebMap and just pick a different transform, in this case Kendo or Angular, let's see what that looks like. The code is going to be very similar. The difference being that we're going to be using the Angular API instead of the Kendo API. So a lot of the changes will be over on the JavaScript side. So if we build this and run it, we're going to see a very different look and feel. Remember that the purpose of the Kendo transform is to keep the user interface very similar to the Windows version. Maybe you don't want to have to retrain your users, or maybe it's very control rich and it displays better on a large screen that way. On the Angular version, we get more of a responsive design. Why is that not running on? Hold on. There we go. And here's our splash screen. And now we have a very different sort of style. Instead of having UI elements that are sort of in a grid, you know, from left to right and top to bottom, they tend to be arranged vertically. And the reason for that is because now we have a responsive design. So as I shrink the browser, we automatically reflect how that looks here. And notice that where before we had a menu up here, down menu that we recreated, when we make the browser window too small to reflect that window, we get the bootstrap-like menu here that we can use. Okay, and probably this could use a little bit of styling work, and that's probably not the best look and feel right there for those toolbar objects, but you get the idea. It's kind of a different way to do it. Now, a couple other points. What exactly is happening here? When I come down here and fill out this or change this information on the client side in the browser, And then, like for example, when I click through here, if we were to fire up Fiddler or something, what we'd see is that we're going to identify the objects on this screen that's running in the browser that have changed, okay, and what the event was. And we're going to basically serialize that as a JSON object and send it via HTTP as a RESTful service back to the ASP.NET server as a request. The server then has a controller which decides how to route that information. And so it takes the changes, the delta, if you will, in the state, and process that through the existing business logic, which again we haven't really changed. So it doesn't really change the output. Now the state then gets refreshed. Maybe it has to do, like in this case, if I go through the data control, it has to do a database lookup. It then decides which state needs to be sent back to the client as a new delta. That gets serialized as a JSON object and gets sent back. And then the Angular, in this case, the Angular JavaScript framework takes that and rebuilds the view model as new HTML and new CSS and displays it to the user. So then the view is refreshed. So if you watch over here either in Visual Studio with this in the event handlers here, you can actually see what's getting sent back and forth, or if you look at Fiddler. So that's our demo. Let me switch back real quick to our PowerPoint here. Kind of wrap this up. So just to recap, we started with VB6. That application actually was an MDI application, which is very common. It used very standard controls. You know, a lot of these use multiple forms. We converted it again to a .NET version. It was actually also MDI. We migrated all of the objects to .NET Native. So, you know, no problems there with performance or with support. And everything was moved over to .NET. We can build it in Visual Studio and run it, and it preserves the look and feel. That's a Windows version. But now for a web version, we move it over to HTML5. We migrate it to JavaScript and HTML and CSS on the client side, and ASP.NET MVC on the server side. Runs on pretty much any modern browser. It will implement MDI. I didn't show that, but what we can do is keep these forms sort of as a persistent link when they haven't been explicitly closed, and the user can just bring them back up. There's no browser plugins here. We're not using any of the things like Silverlight used to use or Flash used to use, so it will run on any clean HTML5 implementation. We're not using a lot of exotic HTML5 stuff, so most modern browsers will run these things very cleanly. Let's talk about a couple of case studies real quick. National Systems is a ISV that sells call center software. It's used by Pizza Hut. They have users all over the country who use a telephone system that routes calls for orders directly to them, and then they enter the data into a VB6 application, and it gets posted at the closest Pizza Hut store, restaurant, whatever they're called, for them to build it and deliver it. They had a problem with configuration and rolling out releases and updates across that user base, so they wanted a web version. WebMap allowed them to build a web version and offer their software as a subscription model instead of a license model. They had a very, very high requirement for reliability of the resulting application because of the sheer volume of pizzas that are ordered in the United States of America on days like Halloween or Super Bowl Sunday. It's a phenomenal number of pizzas, and they had to be able to make sure all those orders work. So they have a very scalable solution. It runs flawlessly, and they're very happy with it. Hutchins Systems is another ISV that sells software to automobile dealers to do credit analysis and reporting and lookups. They also had a problem with their user base with a variety of VB6 installations that required a lot of configuration. support when they rolled out new releases, and they also wanted to have a software as a service model. By using WebMap and the Kendo JavaScript framework, they were able to roll out a web-hosted version very quickly that is highly reliable, allows them to collect recurring revenue on a monthly basis instead of whenever they sell updates, and more importantly, didn't change the requirement to, they didn't have to retrain their users, because the resulting application, although it's nice and new looking, it works exactly like the Windows application, the VB6 version. So they were able to save a lot of money compared to trying to write this from scratch, and they didn't have to try to debug all of their internal business logic. You can try this yourself. You can go to mobilize.net/register and get your free account on studio.mobilize.net, where you can create a solution, do a trial migration. You can get the source code here for Hello World, or if you email me, I'll send you the before and after source code here for the Salmon King Seafood demo that we just showed. I'll send you a Dropbox link or OneDrive link if you want. It gets kind of large after we put all of the model view controller stuff in it. So this is a great time to open it up for people to type questions in the questions window on your webinar screen. So I'm going to check with my colleagues here and see if we have some that we're ready to answer. Okay, a couple of questions we just have time for before we need to break this up. The first one is about our assessment tool and what information are we uploading. Does it upload any confidential information? No, it doesn't. The assessment tool doesn't upload any source code. It only uploads information about the objects and the nature of the code in your application. So it's basically metadata, and if you can look at the data that's in the assessment directory, and you can see exactly what we upload. It's all in XML, and there's an HTML representation, so it's human readable. Okay, thanks. Yeah, this question is about other application source code. Can we do other transformations? Specifically, as one person asked about Silverlight. Yes. As you know, Silverlight is out of support by Microsoft and also relies on the Netscape API plugin that is a security hole. So Chrome has disabled it by default. Edge does not support it at all. Only IE and Firefox still supports it. So that's an issue for a lot of people. They want to take those Silverlight web apps and make them HTML. Yeah, we have tools for that. Right now we don't have a tool that you can actually try yourself, but if you contact me or send an email to info@mobilize.net, we can walk you through that and show you what that looks like. We've done some projects for some people to exactly that transformation. On the same light, here's a question about Power Builder, which is technically not out of support, but it's pretty old stuff. We actually can do Power Builder to Java right now. We're just wrapping up some tooling there, but we are able to help you understand what that would look like. We have a rather interesting approach that I'll tease you. If you have Power Builder, give us a call and we can talk to you about it. It's a little different than what I showed here, but it will give you a Java HTML well-formed web application. And it has some interesting capabilities that allow you to do continuous innovation and improvement on the source code as well. So that's all the questions we have time for right now. I appreciate everybody spending their evening or morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, here with us. And again, contact me if you think of something later. My email is in the mail that you got. Goodbye.